Hi everyone, welcome to the new episode of the Prime You series of interviews with top business and technology experts. I'm Dana Kohut, your host. In this interview episode, we've got the pleasure to sit and talk with Duncan Epping, Chief Technologist at VMware. It's actually our second interview episode, and if you missed the first one, you will find the link to it in the comments below. In this episode, we talked about some important and innovative tech projects that are being built at VMware. It's a project Monterey and project Capitola. Also, we talked about the federated storage platform and how it will change the game for enterprises in data storage. It's a great interview with lots of valuable insights. Therefore, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't done it yet. And don't forget to give us some thumbs up so we know that you enjoy the content that we create for you. Stay tuned. Hi, Duncan.
How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm good.
Yeah. Okay, great. It's great to catch up with you after a while.
No problem.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you great. What about me? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so Duncan, you last time we were in touch, I believe you were about to leave for a live event somewhere in Middle East. Have you managed to catch up with other live events, or maybe I'm mistaken during the year?
Yeah, that could be right. I did a lot of travel over the last, before COVID occurred, I did do a lot of travel. Now it actually completely stopped. So yeah, I haven't done any travel over the past 2 years, basically since January of last year. It completely came to a stop, like, for most people, I guess. But yeah, for me, that was a big change because, when you tend to go to a lot of events and now you end up sitting at home and working from your office, it is, a pretty big change, but it is what it is, right? Everyone had to adapt, and so did I.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, so I would also be interested how that actually impacted your work with the tech community, right? Since you are the prominent advocate of VMware technology, right? And you are promoting, right, the technology. So how that lockdown, right, impacted your interaction with the users?
Yeah, at first it was quite a big impact because we weren't sure what was going to happen. And I think the first 2 months, it was probably like February when it really started for us. The first month, maybe 2 months, most of the events were canceled or postponed. Everyone expected this to blow over in 2-3 months, and then we'll get started with these physical events again. As we all know, that didn't happen. And to be honest, I more or less expected that we wouldn't go back at that rapid pace. So what we ended up doing, and I think this was quite interesting, is two of my colleagues and I, we figured, if we're not going to go back to physical, we may as well see if we can create this virtual roadshow. So basically what we did is we looked at what we would normally do for the user community. And at a typical user community event, we will present sessions that are about 45 minutes to an hour. And we typically do a keynote, and then there are some breakout sessions. But the challenge, of course, is, as you know, when you do things virtually, right, no one is going to sit behind the screen, watch 3 sessions that take 60 minutes each. So we changed the format a bit, and we created these sessions which were about 30 minutes long. And with the 3 of us, we created sessions that in some shape or form had something to do with each other. So there was a clear concept defined for those 3 sessions. So just to give an example, the first speaker would talk about app modernization. Then the second speaker would talk about Kubernetes, which is where the app modernized apps would land on. And then the third speaker would talk about the infrastructure itself on which Kubernetes would land. So you start off with an introduction, then you start talking about the applications, and then you start talking about the infrastructure layer itself. And that actually landed very well. I think we've probably did over 90, more than 90 events throughout the world. Most of them, of course, in Europe. And the interesting thing was the following, because we've also used Zoom. And what we actually did is, what you see with a lot of these virtual events is that people either pre-record their sessions, or when they do their event itself, the speakers don't really engage with the audience. We did the complete opposite, right? All of our sessions were live, But on top of that, what we also did is we encouraged the audience to ask questions either in the chat or in the Q&A window, or after every session, we would also have 10 minutes left for Q&A specifically. Now, what would happen during a session, of course, is people would start typing in these questions, and then what we would do is, if someone had a question, we would address the question during the session itself. So although we would have like a 30-minute time slot, we knew multiple questions would pop up. So we had 25 minutes of worth of content. And then during the session, someone asks a question, and I would say, okay, Dana, that's a great question that you asked. Let me address that straight away. Now, by mentioning your name, right, people also immediately feel extremely engaged. They understand that you're following the chat. You're trying to figure out what people are interested in, and that sparks up a lot more questions and a lot more interest for the session itself. So I must say, although we didn't expect it at first, we weren't sure what to expect. It worked extremely well. Hopefully, we'll go back to physical events again in the upcoming year. But considering the situation right now in Europe, it's probably going to take another 6 months. I can't see it changing fast, to be honest.
Yeah, I see. Wow, that's that's a great example of taking advantage of the circumstances, right? The way how you manage to actually engage with the audience, right, and the users. I really like this. Yeah, so that's very interesting. And maybe you could give some advice to other leaders of the tech communities, how they can actually maintain this relationship, right? That missing part of live events, right? How can keep that relationship live?
Yeah, I think the key thing, first of all, is you need to figure out what the audience is interested in. I think that is the key thing, right? So one of the things that we try to figure out by asking questions on Twitter is, what kind of content would they be interested in? What would be the length of the event that they would be interested in? There's no point in doing an 8-hour virtual event if people can only stay focused for 60 minutes or 90 minutes. And what we found out is that 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours at most. That's the amount of time that people are comfortable with. Anything longer than that, people are not interested in most cases. Or, they will dial in for the first session and then they will disappear for 4 hours and then they'll dial in for another session. And at that point in time, you kind of lose the interaction. The other thing I think is just engage with people. Try to actively engage with them and ask them for questions, ask them for, what they are interested in. One of the things that we, for instance, also did is we would show up 10 minutes early for every single event. And while we would show up, people would just start dropping into the Zoom sessions and everyone's microphone was open. And we would just have a regular chat with the attendees. We would have a regular chat with the leaders, with some of the community leaders. And, that would also, kind of relieves the pressure of people, right? They feel like they're part of this discussion instead of watching someone up on stage, which it can be daunting or difficult to ask a question for some people. And the other thing is because we basically ask people to ask questions in the chat or the Q&A window instead of asking them through a voice. That also lowered the bar for people to ask a question. Not everyone is a native English speaker. I'm not a native English speaker myself either. So I know it can be difficult to stand up. In this case, you don't need to stand up, but you still need to open up your mic and ask that question in front of 70, 80, maybe 150 people, could be even more than that. So for a lot of people, that is challenging. So using chat windows, using Q&A, that is a bit easier for people. The other thing, and this is something that I've also done the past 3 months actually, is I started 2 new podcasts. So I started a podcast in English, which is called Unexplored Territory. So if you
I was about to ask you about,
if you look that up on any of the podcast apps, it's available for free. I also started one in my own native language in Dutch. And some people are like, oh, why would you start one in Dutch? Because the audience that you will have for the English podcast is probably going to be 10 times bigger. Yeah, it is going to be 10 times bigger. And actually it is, much bigger than the Dutch one. But then again, for us, it's also much easier to have these conversations with various people in our own language. It's also fun to do something in your own language. And yeah, sure, you may not reach as many people, but on the other hand, it's not just about the quality. It's not just about the quantity, but it's also about the quality of material that you end up delivering. And whether it's 50 people or 500 or 5,000 people listening to it, if 50 people are happy with the content, then I'm happy as well, right? So I think it's about engaging the people in the right way with the right content. I think that's what it's all about.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I can totally relate to that part where you say about being native speaker in English, right? I'm not either a native speaker, so I can feel really well what you're talking about. So tell us more about that new podcast, right? I saw you've got a great guest there from VMware. You talk about technologies and other things. So how different it is from other things that you are actively involved into, like you've got your own blog, right? And you do different events, so how different it is and what actually your listeners can get there.
Yeah, it's very different than the blog. I mean, if you look at the blog, it's primarily technical content. Of course, there's some visionary and strategic content there as well. But with the podcast, we're trying to do something different. First of all, I'm hosting the podcast with two other guys, so Frank Denneman and Johan van Amersfoort. But to be clear, the podcast is not about us, right? When people heard that we were starting a podcast, they expected it would be just be the three of us chatting with each other about technology. That's not it. For the very first episode, for instance, we had Kit Colbert, the new CTO for VMware, as a guest. And I think out of the 55 minutes of that first episode, it was Kit talking for 50 minutes. And that's what we prefer to see. Of course, there needs to be a conversation in some shape or form. But we're inviting people because we think they are interesting guests or they have an interesting topic to discuss. If we're talking for 40 minutes or for 30 minutes or even for 20 minutes, there's something wrong, right? So our focus, first of all, is on the people, on the story, or on the technology that they want to discuss. Now, the other thing that we wanted to focus on is a couple of aspects. First of all, we wanted to make sure that we had technical content there. So, of course, we're going to talk to technical folks, try to keep it as deep technical as possible. The other thing that we wanted to make sure is that we had people talking about the vision of the company or the strategic directory of the direction of the industry itself. So, for instance, the last episode was with Sean Bass. Sean Bass is the CTO for end user computing at VMware, and we spoke about the direction of at which end user computing is heading towards, what is happening from a security perspective, what can people expect in terms of the management of devices, et cetera. And we did something similar with Kit Colbert, for instance. With Kit, we spoke about the direction of cloud native, what he sees in the industry next. And I think those are interesting things for people in IT as well. It's not all purely focused on VMware. Of course, a lot of it is related to what we are doing, but we're also trying to keep it a bit broader. And at the same time, try to go in depth as well where we can. So I think from that perspective, it is slightly different than most other podcasts out there. And hopefully, from this podcast episode, we'll see some new subscribers.
Sure. Yeah, I will actually include the link to your podcast and
awesome.
With absolutely. So, Duncan, do you also plan to invite guests outside of VMware? Because you mentioned it's if focus it a bit broader, right, than just VMware technologies. So, what's your plan there?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's actually something that we're already doing. We're trying to figure out more or less, what kind of people we will be inviting. So, there needs to be some kind of relationship for now with what VMware is doing, because that's primarily the audience that we have at this point in time. But like right now, I'm planning an episode with a product manager of one of the VMware partners doing something in the storage space. I'm not going to reveal yet who it is, but it's going to be a storage partner talking about virtual volumes probably. So I think that is something that interests a lot of people. One of the other things, for instance, that we are considering now is talking to someone from, for instance, an NVIDIA to talk about AI and ML. But then what do we do jointly? But also, of course, what is the direction that NVIDIA is heading in? Because it doesn't necessarily all need to be VM related. We do feel that it all needs to be, for now, technology related. But having said that, like I said, I also do a podcast in Dutch. The one in Dutch, we just recorded an episode with a woman talking about women in IT, so primarily discussing diversity and inclusion. It's not something that people would expect from three guys, probably, but we felt like it was an interesting topic, and I also felt it was a very interesting discussion with some interesting outcomes. It's probably not something that everyone would expect. When you see the three of us, you wouldn't expect us to discuss that topic and be open and frank about that as well at the same time.
Well, that's unfortunate that I cannot listen to that and understand what you do, because I actually do believe that's a very important topic of diversity in IT. Right, we still can see that males, right, men are dominant in the technology, though, and many women, though they are working in the industry, they somehow are a bit of invisible, right? We cannot see so many women. Yep. And actually what I can say that here and for the Prime, I've been, reaching out to lots of women and inviting them to actually to be featured, and they somehow feel uncomfortable, that like they don't feel that they have the story to tell. And I believe that has to change as well. So that is a very important topic that you actually raised here.
Yeah, and on that topic, I've of course followed your YouTube channel, and I noticed there were a lot more women lately. Absolutely. And I do agree with you. I think it would be good for women in general to talk about what they are doing. I mean, you don't necessarily need to, be a principal engineer at Amazon or whatever it is. Everyone has got something interesting to say about their experience, about what they're working on, whatever it may be. There's plenty of things to discuss. You don't necessarily need to be a chief technologist, in my opinion. And I understand it's difficult to get in front of a camera and to tell your story. I've always been afraid of public speaking, but as soon as you've done it once or twice, it just gets easier, and it probably will result in other opportunities in terms of networking, maybe career opportunities. So I do think it's extremely important, to be on a YouTube channel like the one you have.
Yeah, totally agree with you. And your story is very motivating one, right? That you actually started your blog and you landed a great job, right? And now you are the thought leader, right, on the industry. So maybe you could briefly share, right? I think that we touched on your story, right? How you actually got that job and but maybe you could briefly tell us, right, how starting the blog and getting where you're now. So what were the steps there?
Yeah, I mean, I worked for a consultancy company back then. I was basically just doing consulting gigs, implementing vSphere or VMware back then. It wasn't even called vSphere. It was just ESXi and vCenter at various companies, just typically smaller companies, anywhere in the range from 5 to 10 servers. And I figured I needed to have a place to start documenting some of the issues that I encountered. And it was always one of the things that I've been passionate about, is just sharing things with other people. And in this particular case, it was technology, but I used to have a website which was dedicated to alternative music. And it literally had thousands of people, online every day, reading reviews, posting about music, etc., etc. And back then, what I noticed is that when you do something like that and you have a particular regular cadence, whether that's once a day, twice a week, 6 times a week, whatever it ends up being, once a month, as long as you stick to that cadence and you just keep on going with that cadence and you ensure that you have decent quality content, that at some point in time, people will start to notice, right? And it's not like I started my blog because I wanted people to notice it, but I did know that if I would put in the same amount of effort as I did with the alternative music website that I had, that at least, I wasn't doing it just for myself, that other people would benefit from it as well. Now, when I started doing it, just to be clear, VMware was just, I wouldn't say coming up, but it was at the point of time where it was kind of exploding. Right? There were more and more people interested in it, and more people started adopting it, implementing it. So it was literally at the sweet spot. So I was kind of lucky from that perspective, although it's not necessarily luck that brought me there, but lucky in terms of the point in time where I started it. And I guess because I just kept on doing it almost on a daily basis, I was literally putting blog articles out every day. If you go to my website, I literally have thousands of articles. And back then I was literally doing one article a day at a minimum for years. And as a result, it meant that some of the folks that worked for VMware, but also folks that work for Dell EMC, for instance, started noticing my content. So when they were looking for someone for a particular job role in the Netherlands, one of the names, of course, that popped up was my name, because I was one of the few folks that was actually actively blogging about the technology. Sort of figured, the guy must know something about it, otherwise he wouldn't be posting about it every day. So, that resulted in me actually taking a job with VMware, which at that point in time, to be honest, was a consultancy job. So it was, I shouldn't say a lower ranked, because that kind of feels, degrading to people who are still doing that job. But if you look at the organization itself, I came in at one of the lowest layers in the organization. But again, I knew that if I would just continue doing what I was doing in terms of putting my name out there, that at some point in time, other people would notice as well. So what I ended up doing is, if I would publish an article and it related to, let's say, storage, I would try to engage with the product manager for storage to figure out if I could help him or her in some shape or form in terms of providing feedback from the field into the development team. If I saw an issue from an availability perspective, I would reach out to the engineer and to the product manager. And I started building my network that way, just through communication. And that is one of the things that I noticed, right? Whether it's blogging, whether it's YouTube, whether it's podcasting, one of the things that I think is most important in life, and of course, in your day-to-day work as well, as communication. Everything happens through communication. If you don't talk to people, nothing is going to happen. So that is one of the things that I've always focused on, is communicating with people, trying to build a network, trying to figure out what people are doing, connecting other people with each other as well. And sometimes there could be engineers literally sitting, 2 rooms next to each other, connecting them, right? There's value in that as well. So that is something that I've focused on. And as a result, because my name started popping up in random places, I was offered various opportunities, from joining the technical marketing team and in the end joining the office of CTO. So, I think in general, for people, doing something or at least improving your communication skills is extremely important.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story, and I believe that would be a great motivation for lots of people who have this daunting feeling, right, of actually speaking, right, or telling about the technology or connecting with the network. And it's something that just came to my mind. I've recently been talking with one of the startup founders and inviting to the show, and he said, I would rather send like developer advocate person who knows our technology, right? So person did not feel comfortable talking firsthand about their company, why they have actually started, and so on. So, and I primarily believe that actually that's a job of a founder, right, where they know the best about their product and why they have done that. And so your story is really fascinating, and I believe really motivating, might be motivating for many people out there who are still, like kind of not sure whether to start blogging or doing the podcast and other things of communicating.
Yeah, and of course there are many other things that you could do, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be blogging or podcasting or whatever it is, but just communicating with people internally within the company, using Slack or email or whatever it is, trying to figure out who's responsible for what, providing feedback. Those things are extremely important as well. You don't necessarily need to put it out on a blog if you don't feel comfortable getting up on a stage or presenting for a community group. You don't necessarily need to do that, but reaching out to people internally and providing feedback is already extremely valuable. That's also something that can bring you a long way, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, great. Duncan, now I would like to, I've been reading about the VMware news, right? And there are lots of things happening right now. So I'd like to take our step to discussing, right, what's new in the technology from VMware. And I noticed your post about the concept of federated storage platform. Maybe you could tell our listeners a bit more about that platform and how it differs from other VMware storage technologies available.
Yeah, sure. It was actually my manager who wrote the article, Mark Fleischman. Mark is the CTO for storage and availability, or at least he was the CTO for storage and availability, but he's now the CTO for the cloud infrastructure business group, so for the whole cloud platform itself. And what he basically was talking about was the concept of creating a storage platform that would allow you to manage storage across the data center. If you look at VMware right now, we have this management solution called vCenter Server. And vCenter Server basically manages hosts and could manage storage as well. Storage like, for instance, VMware vSAN. So vSAN is our storage platform. Now, of course, there are other storage platforms out there as well. You have Dell EMC, you have Pure Storage, you have HPE, you have IBM. There's a multitude of different vendors out there. So what we actually started looking into is if it would be possible to create a control plane that was capable of managing all of these different storage platforms. So not just our own storage platform, but also the other storage platforms, and not just within vCenter Server, but across multiple vCenter Server instances. So now you may ask, why would you have multiple vCenter Server instances? Well, of course, there are some limitations here and there, right? There's only an X number of hosts that you could have with each vCenter Server. There's only an X number of clusters that you could have in each vCenter server. So there are various reasons why you would have multiple vCenter server instances. Now, these typically are larger customers, right? So we're talking about large enterprise customers. They may have 10 or 20 different vCenter servers. If that is the case, what they need to do now is when they have vSAN, for instance, they have a vSAN data store or a vSAN cluster per compute cluster. And they need to manage that separately as well. When it comes to their storage systems, they may have a Pure Storage system sitting there. They may have a Dell EMC system sitting somewhere else. They may have a NetApp filer. They're also individually managing all of those different components. And now when they need to place a virtual machine, or they want to create, let's say, a new cloud-native application, and they want to store that data of that cloud-native application somewhere, they need to go through this decision tree in their head and try to figure out where they place the data, where they place the virtual machine. So this new federated storage platform is aiming to help you with that process. So it's aiming to help you with the provisioning of those virtual machines, of those cloud-native applications, by connecting all of those storage components across the data center. So if you want to deploy a cloud-native app, and there are particular capabilities that need to be associated with that application, and with capabilities, I'm referring to things like maybe you want to replicate the data. Maybe you want to snapshot the data, and maybe you expect that that virtual machine or that cloud-native app is going to produce 1 million IOPS, right? You will be able to specify in a policy what those capabilities or characteristics of the virtual machine would look like, and then that policy engine, that federated platform, is going to take the policy, it's going to look at the policy, it's going to look at all of the different storage platforms available, and then it's going to tell you, okay, this application should probably land on the NetApp storage system, and preferably on NFS. Or it may say, okay, you have a Pure Storage system sitting here. That Pure Storage system is capable of doing 20 million IOPS, so it's the perfect platform for that. Or it's going to tell you, well, you want to have storage replication, and it needs to be synchronous storage replication. This Dell EMC storage array is capable of delivering that. So that is basically what we're aiming for with this platform. And of course, as I've already mentioned, the unique thing here is that you will be able to do that across vCenter instances. And it's going to provide that backend storage connection for you. So instead of you running around with cables and plugging everything into everything, it's going to ensure that you will be able to access all of those different storage systems, basically like a mesh network.
Yeah, that sounds like a one-stop shop for data storage management, right? We're a larger organization, because what I got from what you were saying, that's meant for large organizations, right, that are running terabytes of data, and they need to have this visibility, right, with what is happening across different storages. Yeah, so that is fascinating. Maybe you could tell us some use cases, right, for federated storage platform.
Yeah, I think you've already mentioned one use case, right? It's primarily targeted at the larger enterprise customers. We have some larger enterprise customers, and I recently spoke with one. I think they had like 25 different storage systems just for file services. And then they had multiple block storage systems there, sitting there as well. And although they did have a lot of automation around it, the problem that they had is that they were responsible for maintaining those automation processes as well. And what they told us that it was extremely complex to keep those up to date, right? Especially between the different releases of the software of all of those different storage platforms. In some cases, APIs change, certain capabilities are unsupported or deprecated. which means that they need to have 1 or 2 engineers constantly looking at these different versions and reiterating all of the different automation processes, all of the different scripts that they created. So in those cases, right, that is one of those use cases where a platform like this will actually do all of that for you. It will make your life a lot easier in terms of the automation aspect, primarily because it will have one front-end API and you will be accessing the front-end API. So you may be provisioning a new virtual machine in a fully automated fashion, or maybe you need to have a persistent volume for a cloud-native app. Well, you will access our API, and then of course at the lowest layer, we will orchestrate the rest for you. So that is typically where the majority of the complexity comes into play, the orchestration aspect of all of the different components for all of those different storage platforms. Because of course, Dell EMC, for instance, has a completely different API and a completely different structure of their API than, for instance, NetApp has or VMware vSAN has. So all of the different storage platforms will have different ways of allowing you to create objects or allowing you to create files or block volumes or whatever it is that you are requesting. So that is one of the primary use cases that we are seeing out there. Now, having said that, I do want to make sure that people understand that this is something that we are now actively exploring. So this is something that we are researching. We've already created a proof of concept. So we know that it works, but it's still under development. So there's no guarantee on when this would be released or even if this would be released, right? So hopefully that is something that people understand. But if people have feedback, make sure to leave a comment in the YouTube channel, because I'm happy to take that back to the engineering team.
Wow, okay, that sounds very interesting. And you mentioned that you're not sure whether it's going to be released, right? It's just that kind of prototype. But what you said, it sounds that you're tackling with that technology, you're tackling a very important challenge that large organizations have. So why do you think there might be some challenges with actually releasing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this always applies to any project that we are doing. And I think this applies to every company out there. Sometimes the industry just goes into a different direction, right? Mm-hmm. We've seen this, for instance, with cloud native applications. 8 years ago, or even 5 years ago, the majority of us did not expect that containers and Kubernetes would take off at the pace that it did take off, right? Something similar could be said for blockchain, right? 5 years ago, barely anyone was talking about blockchain or crypto. Today, everyone is talking about it. So sometimes, things happen within an industry which result in, the fact that you need to revise what you're working on or rethink your plan. So that is something that, of course, could always happen. Now, would I expect that would happen in this case? I don't expect that to be the case. I would expect that customers are always in need of a data management platform, but you never know. That's why I'm putting that disclaimer out there. So people don't make purchasing decisions, for instance, based on something that may or may not happen in the future.
I got this. Yeah, that's a very honest, to communicate with your customers, right? The honest way of putting things, right, about the technology and how they might develop. Yeah. So another thing that I've noticed on the VMware right news is about Project Monterey. So I know some in the community there was discussion whether it's a new hardware accelerator, right? That are traditionally used to make challenges in workloads and security boundaries, but I know that it's not, right? So maybe you could tell us more about that project and what VMware is trying to achieve there.
Yeah, sure. I think it's probably good to understand where it's coming from, right? So there's something that's happening in the industry over the last, couple of years, and that's these offloading hardware cards. Now, we've seen that with GPUs. GPUs have been around for a while, but we're now also starting to see, at least something that we've starting to see in the last 2 years, is that there are more and more companies doing something in the smart NIC space. And with smart NIC, basically meaning a NIC, a network interface card on steroids. So a network interface card that actually has a decent amount of CPU capacity and a decent amount of RAM. And that network card would basically allow you to offload certain processes to that network card itself. Now, that is one of the reasons that we started looking into what can we do with these types of devices. Now, I mentioned the smart NIC. Some companies also refer to it as a DPU, for instance. so data processing unit. So depending on which vendor you're talking to, it could be named either a smart NIC, a DPU. There are various names that we've seen popping up, but what I'm referring to is an offload card from a networking perspective. Now, the interesting thing with these types of cards, as I've already mentioned, in my opinion, is the fact that they have a significant amount of CPU and RAM, which also means that we potentially, from a VMware perspective, can start offloading certain capabilities to those cards. If you look at our stack, we do a couple of things. So we have the compute portion of things. Then, of course, we have a networking component and a security component, and there's a storage component on top of that. Now, you can imagine that some of those components, like for instance, networking and security, could be offloaded to the DPU, to the smart NIC. Now, you may ask yourself, why would you do that, right? If you can just handle or take care of that on the regular x86 processor. Well, you can imagine that if you need to do everything on the x86 processor, even if you have 24 cores or more per CPU, it's still going to be a significant amount of gigahertz or cycles that are going to be used by those processors, right? If you can offload those processors to the smart NIC, then you will have more cycles for your traditional or your cloud native applications that may run on that x86 platform. The other thing is as well, because you're now offloading certain capabilities to the smart NIC, you're also creating a form of isolation between those different processors. So between the workloads and the infrastructure processors. So on one hand, you may have all of your infrastructure processors running, or the security and networking processors running on the smart NIC, while all of the workloads are running on that x86 processor. So there's now a clear delineation between those processors and workloads as well. Now that's just the storage or just the networking and security side of things. Now, of course, you can also imagine we do something similar from a storage perspective, because these devices and now also will allow us to start interconnecting hosts with each other. Because they have CPU and memory available, they could potentially assist in things like deduplication and compression. So instead of having the CPU again handling that, we can now offload those cycles to the DPU. And on top of that, it may also enable us to start connecting different types of compute instances to each other. Now, let me explain what that means, compute instances, right? As we are VMware, we expect that the majority of the workloads typically end up on top of a hypervisor. But we've all seen data centers, and we all know that in some data centers, there are still physical workloads. Now, in some of those data centers, those physical workloads may need to get access to some of the resources from a storage perspective or from a security and networking point of view that are running on top of your hypervisor, so on top of your cloud platform. By using a smart NIC, we now, in the future, may also be able to start connecting those components. So you could envision that at some point in time, through your smart NIC technology and Project Monterey, you will be able to connect a physical machine to this virtual storage platform that runs on top of vSphere, right? All through the power of that smart NIC capability. So yeah, in my opinion, it's a very interesting solution that is being built. And of course, we're not just doing this by ourselves, right? Of course, VMware is doing some of the story or some of the software aspect of things, but we need to work closely with our partners like NVIDIA, Intel, and then there's Pensando as well that we work with. Pensando is one of the startups in this space. But those three, NVIDIA, Intel, and Pensando are probably one of the three bigger players when it comes to smart NIC technology.
That's very interesting, that part, of partnership with other larger players on the market. So can you tell me how that exactly works, and how do you organize the work, right, on specific technology, right, with your partners?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, in this particular case, I'm not directly involved with the smart NIC technology, so I haven't been involved in the conversations with NVIDIA and with Pensando. But from a high-level perspective, we have a lot of partnerships happening with various companies throughout, and that could be indeed those smart NIC vendors, but also NVIDIA for GPUs, AMD for GPUs, Intel, of course, for various different reasons. They have all of these different projects that are running. So what we tend to do is we tend to try to align with them, at least try to figure out what their roadmap looks like in terms of what they are building, and then at the same time we try to figure out what we can do with the new type technology and how we can enable them to sell more of their solutions on top of our platform, because we strongly feel that these are opportunities to not only help our customers, but also to ensure that we work well with our partners. So if you look, for instance, at an NVIDIA, one of the things that we recently announced, and something that you may have seen as well, is this enterprise-ready platform, or this AI-ready platform. So the AI enterprise-ready platform enables customers, for instance, to deploy a solution which has been certified both by NVIDIA as well as VMware, that comes with the right components, and to bring a AI ML solution into production extremely fast. So through developing these types of offerings with our partners, we not only help our customers, but we also help our partners and ourselves, of course, by creating these solutions that will make it easier to sell these platforms.
Yeah, and I think that, that's a very smart and efficient way of working in the industry that is highly competitive. And it's better, instead of having this bleeding edge competition, to partner, right, and to be able to actually deliver the value to your customers, right, through partnerships.
Yeah, it's not just that, right? Because we do feel, of course, there's a large amount of value for our customers. There's a large amount of value for us as well in terms of the sales cycle. Mm-hmm. But if you look at it from a customer perspective, one of the things that we, for instance, noticed is that a large portion of and when I say large portion, we're talking about close to 50% of all of the AI ML projects out there that are in proof of concept phase or in testing phase never actually end up going to the production phase. And there are a whole bunch of various reasons for it, but we strongly feel that in a lot of these cases, they don't go to production because they simply implemented the wrong components and are not sure what to do with it. They're not getting the results that they expect that they would get from a time perspective, potentially, maybe from a performance perspective. And as a result, because they are disappointed, they feel it's not ready for prime time yet. Mm-hmm. And they don't take that next step, which is a shame because they've already invested heavily in the proof of concept. We, as partners, have already potentially invested heavily in that proof of concept, and then they never end up taking that next step. So one of the reasons, for instance, we've created this AI-ready platform is to enable our customers to actually do a proof of concept, test the platform out, and then hopefully, when they get the results that they would like to have, take that into production. So it's not just that we've certified components, but we've also made sure that we've created a stack in terms of the software components that will allow them to take that next step.
Yeah, that's a kind of like AI product playground where your customers, they have ability to test and see whether they get the value that they might be expecting to get from the project, right, or from the technology.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, interesting. And another project that I've noticed, right, and it's also been like just recently announced, is Project Capitola, right, where VMware targets a problem of efficient memory use for vSphere installation. So tell us more about the project and what VMware is looking to achieve there.
Yeah, sure. Personally, I didn't really understand Project Capitola at first. It was explained to me about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, when they started working on it. I didn't really understand what the problem was. But the more I started thinking about it, and the more I started looking into this space, it actually started clicking. So one of the things when we started talking to customers is we've already mentioned AI and ML, and we've already spoken about cloud native workloads in the past 40 minutes or so. And when you talk about these types of workloads, one of the things that stand out is that there's a lot of data that needs to be analyzed. There's a lot of data that needs to be looked at. And when you talk about cloud native applications, of course, we're always talking about things like databases and that are in-memory database, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you look at a virtualization platform, or you look at compute platforms traditionally in general, one of the things that people always tend to run out of, right? Even if you look at your laptop, no one ever complains, well, hardly anyone complains about not having enough CPU capacity, but the majority of people will complain about memory capacity, right? And this is something that traditionally happens in the enterprise as well. There's a lot of new projects being started, and one of the trends that we've seen is that a lot of more people are asking about a solution that will allow them to have more memory against a lower cost. Now, if you look at the price of memory, it's certainly not going down rapidly, right? So if you look at a terabyte of memory, Yeah, it's not cheap. So one of the things the customers asked us is, can you help us reducing the cost of deploying these memory heavy or greedy applications, right? And that is something that we're aiming to do with Project Capitola. Now, there are a couple other things in play here, because you may ask yourself, why wouldn't customers just simply add more DIMMs, for instance, memory modules to their host? Well, going into a data center and inserting new DIMM modules into a server isn't as easy as it sounds. First of all, you need to have DIMM slots available. Most servers are limited in terms of the amount of DIMM slots that they have, simply because of the amount of pins that will go to the CPU. So they can only have a limited number of DIMM slots on that motherboard, which means they only have a limited number of memory that they can insert. Now, of course, you could replace the memory, but if you need to take out all of the memory and insert new memory, then you're basically throwing away the old memory, and then you need to buy new memory. So it comes at a pretty high cost. So we started looking into a couple of things with Project Capitola. And so basically we're looking at it into two different phases. So first of all is what we're planning on introducing in the future, and what we're working towards, what we're now researching, is the ability to have some form of memory tiering. Now, with memory tiering, we are talking about different types of memory. So you have the traditional DRAM type of memory, which is nanosecond access times. Typically, we're talking about DIMM modules, which are 32 gigs, maybe 64 gigs, depending, of course, on what you're planning on doing with the platform. But one of the other things that we also have available is persistent memory. So with persistent memory, we're talking about these newer types of devices, which basically present a new memory layer, which is typically extremely fast flash, but it's accessed in the exact same way as a memory module. So what we're planning for with Project Capitola is the ability to have multiple types of memory within your system, which may look the same for to the application, but is basically the platform will start scheduling access to that memory in a particular way so that it's optimal for the platform and optimal from a cost perspective. So you will have two memory tiers, and the memory tiers would be accessible for the application and for the virtual machine, but they come at a different cost. So one memory tier may cost you, let's say, $1,000 for 32 gigs. With the other one, you may have a terabyte worth of capacity for $1,000. So as you can imagine, so there's a completely there's completely different price model associated with it. And the aim with Project Capitola is that you're capable, or will provide a platform that will automatically place memory pages on the or on the tier where we feel it should exist. So if it's accessed more frequent, for instance, of course we can always move memory around. Now, the other thing that we're planning for, and this is the phase 2 aspect of Project Capitola, is the ability to start clustering memory. And with clustering memory, we're actually talking about accessing memory over the network. So basically placing memory pages on another host. With VMware, when you have multiple physical machines, you typically end up creating a cluster. You can imagine that within the cluster, you could say, okay, all of this memory should also be clustered. So host A should be able to access the memory of host B. Now, the important part here, of course, is when we talk about memory access, is that we typically talk about nanoseconds worth of latency. When you access something over the network, of course, the latency is going to be increased. So it comes at a cost. Now, this is probably also where, for instance, Project Monterey comes into play as well, because a smart NIC will provide you high bandwidth at a lower latency than most traditional NICs. So you can imagine that these different types of projects that are happening right now, Capitola and Monterey, could potentially be used at the same time for organizations when they're trying to lower the total cost of ownership for their cloud platform.
Yeah, that is fascinating, and also the importance how each project that it's like interrelated, right, with each other. Is this Project Capitola already up and running, or it's still being built?
No, but Project Capitola is being researched and being worked on right now. Project Monterey is actually, as far as I know, for Project Monterey, there's an early access program. So if you go to Google and you look up the early access program for Project Monterey, you can actually get access to it. But of course, you need to have smart NICs, etc., available for Project Capitola. This is something that was announced at VMware as a project that we are now investigating, /researching, /working on. So if and when that would make it, I'm not sure. Of course, there are a couple of other things happening in the industry as well that we may benefit from. We may incorporate in it. It may be something that you've heard of, but PCIe Gen 5 is, for instance, something that is going to pop up rather soon. And then there's the CXL as well, so the Compute Express Link, which is a protocol that runs on top of PCIe 5. And that potentially will also allow us to access different types of memory, not just persistent memory, but for instance, Samsung is working on a memory module which sits in a PCIe slot and is accessed over CXL, so the Compute Express Link protocol. And it seems like traditional regular DRAM, but it's actually this small 3.5-inch module, right? It's very funny what's happening at this point in time when it comes to memory. So I suspect for Capitola, although there's, like I said, we have this two-phased approach. I think those phases will probably, there's a couple of phases that will be added in the upcoming years based on what's happening in the industry. There's a lot of changes coming from a memory perspective.
Yeah, totally. And that with the pandemic crisis, and there was, a lack of semiconductor and memory cards supply. So I think that's a very burning question in the industry right now. So thanks for sharing that, Duncan, with us.
No problem.
Yeah. Duncan, thank you so much for making the time to join us today. It's been a great pleasure to have you again on the show. And thanks. It's been a great pleasure.
Thanks for having me.